Hey friends, welcome to my channel. My name is Angela. Today I have a new mega video to share with you featuring 10 of my favorite DIY planters that I've made over the past year. Now, some of the voiceovers will be original. Some of them I did have to redo. Some of the music is original. I've definitely learned a lot and grown over the last year, so my editing style may be a little bit different, but I tried to take out anything that didn't necessarily pertain to this video. So I hope you enjoy taking a walk down memory lane with me. Let me know if I missed one of your favorite DIY planters that I've made, and all of the original videos will be linked down in my description box in case you missed one. Let's get started. These are these Dollar Tree mirrors. They had them out a little while ago. I had bought them in white originally, tried to paint them black to make some hexagon shelves, and the paint didn't stick, long story short. So I ended up going back, buying the black ones, and I made these hexagon shelves, which I absolutely love. But I still had these ones left over that were all chippy, messed up, didn't know what to do with, just sitting around. So I sanded off all the black paint, and these are the original color. They were white. So we're gonna attempt something different. I think my problem was I should have sanded down the plastic first to get it to stick. I literally did nothing, just went right in with paint. So now the surface is all roughed up. I sanded it down, sanded all that paint off, and we're gonna try to paint these again and do something different with them. I repainted the frames in a dark navy color, mixing Deep Navy by Apple Barrel and Ink by Waverly. And then because the back of the frames are open, I wanted to fill that in. So I traced the frame both inside and out on foam core board and cut that out. When cutting foam core board, you want to make sure you have a very sharp knife so it doesn't drag against the surface and giving you that jagged edge. Then I glued the foam core onto the backs of my frames using my detail tip, hot glue gun, and Gorilla Glue sticks, and I painted that in navy as well. Next, I'm taking this flat reed that I got from Amazon. This is linked in my description box, and I cut the reed down to fit around the edge of the hexagon. This is also going to cover up the seam where I added the foam core board. And to attach the reed, I'm using E6000 and hot glue for a long-term, short-term hold. When using this combination, you do not want to overlap the two glues. Overlapping them will cause a breakdown in the E6000 and it will not hold up as well over time. Once all of my reed was glued down, I took both hexagons and put one inside of the other to create a three-dimensional piece. I did not glue these in place together because they fit pretty snugly, but you certainly could if you wanted a more secure hold. Next, I took a circle wood round from Walmart and painted it in the same navy color. At first, I had glued just the wood round down inside of the hexagons, but I needed more of a surface for the circle to sit on, so I did go back and add a Jenga block under it. Then I took 4mm macrame cord and wrapped it around the top for a hanger. But if I were to redo this project, knowing what I know now, I would have added a C-hook to the top of the frame and then added macrame or jute twine or something that gave it a little bit more of a cohesive look. So I'll show you the original and then how I updated it for a better aesthetic. Lastly, I took a Dollar Tree terracotta pot, the larger size that comes in a pack of 2, and glued that down to the wood round so it doesn't fall off. And then added in some greenery, and that's it for this one. I'm taking these seed starter pots that I picked up from Dollar Tree. You can also find these pretty much everywhere in the spring and summertime. I used 2 packs, and I believe there's 12 in each pack, and I ripped them up. The size doesn't matter for how large or small you make the pieces because I'm going to break them down even further. Next, I put them in a pot of boiling water and let it boil for about 15 minutes. After the 15 minutes, you want to drain most of the water out of the pot, but leave in a little bit to help with the next step in breaking down the fibers. I tried using a handheld processor here, but that didn't work. It just kept getting clogged, so I got out my mixer and I used that. Once the pots are completely broken down into a fibrous substance, I took a combination of school glue and spackle, adding about half of the larger school glue container and half of the spackle. Next, I'm taking these canisters and adding olive oil all around them, as well as saran wrap to prevent the fiber mixture from sticking to the surface. You could use any shape object you want, a bowl, a vase, anything would work, and then I started adding the fiber mixture around the object. I wanted to make little square type pots, with one being a little larger and one a little smaller. This is definitely a messy process, but a lot of fun. The thicker you make your object, the longer it's going to take to dry. Mine took about 3 days, so keep that in mind if this is something you want to recreate. It is a multi-day project. After these finally dried, I removed them from the canister. This took some muscle. They did not want to budge at first. I was using all of my strength, took my Cricut spatula to loosen it, nothing was helping, and then all of a sudden it just popped right off. I wanted to make these look more aged, like old world pottery. So I started dry brushing, first with an ivory color and then antique wax, and finally added a touch of black for some more depth, and I love the way these turned out. For this project, I'm taking these wedding table topper signs from the Dollar Tree and removed the stands off the back, and then gave them a quick sand to smooth out the surface. Next, I'm taking this wallpaper that my husband brought home for me because his boss was just throwing it away and he knew I could use it for something. I thought these signs looked like a picket fence, so that's what I'm making. I wanted the wood grain of the wallpaper to look like each fence piece was one slat of wood. So you can see there are some seams in the wallpaper where the wood would end. I didn't want that part on my fence pieces. So I cut out the sections I wanted and then glued them down to the signs using Mod Podge. And I put a layer of the Mod Podge on top as well. Once that dried, I flipped the pieces over and used my X-Acto knife to cut off the excess wallpaper. I did paint the backs of my fence pieces along with 2 jumbo popsicle sticks in the color Mineral by Waverly. Then use the popsicle sticks to attach the fence together. This also helps from the front in being able to look like a real picket fence with the little spaces in between each post. Next, I'm taking these terracotta pots. These are the smallest ones Dollar Tree carries that come in a pack of 3, and I had my husband cut them in half for me using his grinder. To add them to the fence, I'm using E6000. I didn't want to chance hot glue with this and risk having the pots fall off and break. To dress up the pots a bit, I'm taking burlap fabric and cut it down into strips to fit around the pot, and I also pulled out a few of the strings to get a frayed edge and glued that down with hot glue. Added some little succulents and flowers into the pots and finished them off with a jute twine bow. I thought the fence was missing a little something, so I did take my antique wax and a chippy brush around the edges, and that's it for this one. For this project, I'm using this adorable dollhouse bathtub from Dollar Tree and a hexagon stencil. I taped down a portion of the stencil. I'm not going to use the whole thing, and I wanted to add a raised stencil to the surface. To do that, I'm using a joint compound and a spatula to spread it on. You can also use spackle or Dixie Belle mud to create a raised stencil like this, and I added a few areas of the stencil around the tub. Once the joint compound was dry, I painted the whole thing in Fawn by Waverly and then added a heavier dry brush over top of the hexagons and a lighter dry brush around the rest of the tub. Inside the tub, I put a block of floral foam and covered that with reindeer moss and then added in some greenery. This has been in my bathroom for over a year now and it has held up even with all of the moisture this room gets. Next up, I'm taking 3 of these shadow boxes from the Dollar Tree and removing the hanger from the back as well as the backer of the frame. And then I popped off those little critters and took some burlap fabric, cut it down to cover the backs of the signs so I didn't have to worry about painting over and covering up the fronts. I pulled out a few strings again around the burlap to fray the edges and glued them down using Mod Podge. Next, I found these tiny little solo cups at the Dollar Tree. They are a little smaller than the small terracotta pots, but either of these options would have worked. I wanted to cut them in half again, so that's why I went with the cups. Those were a little easier to cut down. Then I painted the cups and the frames in ivory. I distressed the outsides of my frames using the colors Fawn and Mineral, and then I took antique wax and focused that on the edges and the corners. Then I glued the burlap part back onto the frames and glued the cups right into the center. You can see here I added a thin tan stripe to the bottom of the cup, but I didn't like the way that looked. So I went over it with a thin coat of ivory to tone it down, and I like the way that looks much better. Then I just stuck some lavender into the cups, and that's it for this one. I am recreating this Urban Outfitters metal wall decor planter for just a few dollars. I'm starting out with this Dollar Tree metal faux galvanized planter, and I tried to use some acetone to remove those letters. I swear I have seen other content creators remove the letters from this galvanized planter. I was not having any luck with the acetone. So then I grabbed my Dollar Tree scraper and tried to scrape off the letters. Honestly, don't even waste your time because those words are actually like raised on the surface of the planter and they're not coming off. So I did end up removing the black part of it, but the letters themselves are still there. In the end, I just took some sandpaper and I scraped off the black part of the letters that way, and that worked out much better, much easier. So if you decide to do this, I would go that direction. Next, we're gonna start painting, and I want to use a sponge for this method. So I'm taking some water in a little bowl and then a little cut up piece of sponge, and I'm just gonna get it completely soaking wet, wring it out, and then we're gonna start dabbing on our paint onto the planter. The first color that I am using is by Folk Art in the color Cinnamon. I really love this color when I wanna do any type of like faux rust or metal type of look, and I'm going for like a rusted copper look on this piece, which is similar to how the original inspiration is. And I did dry using my heat tool in between each color of paint that I added. The next color we're using is Apple Barrel in Burnt Umber. I had started out using this color just around the edges and then like the seams on the sides, but I did end up going over the entire piece with this color. I also thought I went a little bit too heavy-handed with that, so I went back over with the Cinnamon again to get that lightness to come through. And I just kept playing around with the layers, adding the dark and the light where I thought it was needed. Next, I'm taking this metallic Rust-Oleum spray paint in the color Antique Brass, and I'm going to just lightly mist this over top of the piece. I don't want it to be fully covered in this color spray paint. I just want to hit it in some spots just to give that metallic and more metal-like finish. Once that dried, I'm coming back inside and using the Folk Art chalk paint in the color Tuscan Red. This one, I didn't end up mixing the colors completely, like in the bottle, it had kind of separated. So it was looking very purple when I first started applying it, and then I realized I really didn't mix it up well enough because it should be more of like a deep burgundy, perfect rust color. So once I realized that, I did go back over it, and then once that dried, I went in with my like sponge brush. I forget what these things are called. You know what I'm talking about. And I just like deepened up around the edges and the seams to give that like authentic look. Now for the backer that's going to hang on the wall, I'm just taking some foam core board and I'm gonna cut it to the size that I am happy with. Mine ended up being a little bit taller than the inspiration, but that is fine. And then I'm going to just kind of angle those corners so that it's a little bit more, it was like an odd shape, the inspiration piece, which you'll see in the end, but I just took my X-Acto knife and played around with the corners until I was happy with that look. Next, I'm taking some scrap leather that I have. This part isn't really necessary. I just thought that adding that texture that the leather has on the background would just help it to kind of give a different look from that metal planter part. Then I'm taking that same spray paint, and this time I am covering the whole leather fabric swatch with that, and I'm gonna have this as like my underneath color. And then I'm taking the exact same colors that we used on the metal planter to get that same look, but only using my sponge brush here on this one because I wanted it to be a little bit more streaky, which is also how that inspiration piece was. Next, we need to attach that leather to our foam core board. I use decoupage glue here. You could use Mod Podge, you could use a spray adhesive, whatever you are happy using. And then I just laid my fabric down on top of that board, making sure that it did come up around all of the edges a little bit because I wanted to wrap it around the sides. And to do that, I just used my Starbond super glue with the accelerator because the fabric is a little bit thicker and stiffer, so it would stay in place. Then I just cut off any of the excess fabric. To attach the planter, I had to add some of these popsicle sticks because of the lip on that metal planter itself. It wasn't going to touch that fabric or the foam core background, so that's why I added the popsicle stick so it would have something to adhere to. And then to attach the planter, I'm using both E6000 and my hot glue for that short-term, long-term hold. Don't mix them. You can see I put separate dots of each. Then I added my planter down on top. Now I did add a little like 3-pound dumbbell weight to this overnight so that it would stay in place and it would be nice and secure to my backer. Next, I am taking this little screw that was just laying around in my garage and I'm going to place it in my vise because I only want the head of the screw and I'm gonna saw it off. Now I know what you're thinking, but Angela, what if we do not have a beautiful vise like you do? What else can we do? Don't worry, I got you. You can use a miter box like you see me doing here as well. This was a little bit more difficult. It was hard to hold that screw, but it still worked. Next, I'm just attaching those screw heads. You could also use like furniture tacks or thumbtacks. It doesn't have to be a screw for this part. And then I just attached it with my E6000, added a jute twine hanger to the back, and that was it for this one. So let's see what the original cost, $29. Mine was about $2 to make. If you had to buy all of those supplies, it might cost you about $5. I had a lot of it already on hand. But let me know how you think I did compared to the original. I also didn't show it, but I did end up going back and doing the inside of the planter with that same paint finish that we did on the rest of it so that you wouldn't see that silver metal peeking out. Here are the Dollar Tree wood items that we are going to be using for project number 1. I did forget to show those little cube wood pieces, but you'll see those here in just a second. So I'm starting out by removing that back from the picture frame. We don't need this, set that aside for another project, and then also removing those little clips that hold the picture in place. Then I'm taking my Jenga blocks, and here's where you can see those little wood cubes, and I laid everything out in like a lattice formation, or you could call them little X's if you want, and I glued everything together while it was still inside of these frames. And the reason I did that was to make sure after everything was glued together and then I paint everything, it's all going to fit snugly back together, and I won't have to worry about any of my little parts shifting around and not being, you know, if they got off by like a little centimeter or something, it wasn't going to fit back inside of this frame. So I'm using wood glue here and then a paintbrush, and I just smear it across the bottom piece of my Jenga block, add it to that little cube, and then I let everything dry. Now everything is going to get a light coat of my ivory colored chalk paint. I don't mind some of the wood grain peeking through, and then I'm gonna start gluing things together. So using my Starbond super glue, I'm taking one of those Dollar Tree planks and I'm adding it to the back of this picture frame. Then I'm taking another one, I cut it in half, and I'm gluing each half to the sides of another one of those planks. And we're gonna be creating a little box here. So this is the bottom and the sides, and then my fourth plank is going to be the front of it. So it has an opening at the top, and you'll see what I mean here in just a second. Next, I do take some of my my hot glue, and I'm gonna just run a bead along the seam on the inside of my box, and then take my silicone Dollar Tree spatula, smooth out that hot glue, and this is just gonna reinforce my box and make sure it's gonna stay held together. Next, everything is getting a coat of distressing. I thought I put a light distressing on this. I think I went a little heavier than I had intended to, but you know, distressing is personal preference. However you like to distress, heavy, light, not at all, whatever you enjoy. Now we're going to add that little box onto the picture frame, so you can see how I'm gluing it here, and that's why we put that back on the back of the picture frame, so that there would be a back to this little box as well. And then I'm gluing my little lattice piece into the frame as well, all with my Starbond super glue. Then I'm just gonna add in some floral foam. I topped it off with some sheet moss, added some greenery, and that was it for this one. Let me know what you think. For this project, I am taking 5 of these tumbling tower blocks or Jenga blocks, and we are gluing them down together in a row. I started out using my wood glue, but pretty quickly ended up switching over to my hot glue just because I wanted to keep moving along with the project and didn't want to wait for that glue to dry. But for a longer term hold, I would certainly stick with the wood glue. And we're gonna make 4 sets of these 5 blocks. Once you have your 4 sets of 5 blocks, then we are going to create 10 sets of 2 blocks, again, just gluing them in a row, just like you see me doing here. Once all of the glue dries, we're gonna start assembling. So I'm taking one of these 2 block sets and then one of the 5 block sets, and we're gonna create like a little L here. You can see I started adding in my hot glue and mixing it with my, not mixing it, but putting 2 lines, and that didn't really work. The wood glue kind of canceled out my hot glue, and I had to reattach this whole part. But we're gonna be making a little rectangle and then adding the top right here with the second set of 5 blocks. And we're gonna create 2 of those rectangles. Now I'm going to add my sides, and I started out adding 1 block at a time. I would recommend that you create the 10 sets of 2 blocks at the beginning. That way when you put the top on, everything lines up together. I ended up having to play around with the side posts a little bit because they were not perfectly straight the way that I had glued them. Next, we're gonna take the second rectangle that we made in the beginning, and we're gonna add it to the top of our little post that we just added, creating this like rectangular box. And what we are making is actually an open terrarium. So next I'm gonna have to add on the roof, and I wasn't really sure how I was gonna do this at first to get that slanted triangular roof. So I took this multi-pack or variety pack of dowels that I have from Walmart, and I just took the smallest size dowel in that pack, and I'm gonna use that on the edge on both sides of my roof, and that way I can then slant my blocks so that they can create that roof peak. And I'm just gonna cut my dowel down to size here and then hot glue it down right at the very edge of my blocks on both sides. Now we're gonna take those remaining 2 block sets, and here I'm gonna start adding in my hot glue, and you want to make sure you hold this in place at an angle until that glue dries. That way it doesn't start to fall over on you, and it's going to hold that position, which you can kind of see here. I know it's a little bit out of frame. But then I'm going to add that second one on, and I do this 4 more times, adding all 6 of my 2-block sets on top of my roof. Then I did fill in any gaps between that dowel and the block with my hot glue just to make sure the structure was going to be nice and sturdy. Next, I'm taking one of the larger, I think this is the largest size dowel in that variety pack. I'm going to cut this down to size as well. I ended up using my miter box for this one because my miter shears are pretty dull and I really need to get a new blade for those things. Once I had that cut down, I'm gonna use this to just kind of cover up where these blocks sit together, and I did glue them together at the top first just so they wouldn't move around on me while I was trying to add that dowel in place, and then we're going to attach the dowel to the top. Next, I just gave it a really good coat of the Mineral Waverly chalk paint. Now, you could do so many different things with this project. I wanted to keep it minimal, but you could add on rub-on transfers, do decoupage with some napkins, make it colorful, whatever fits your vibe. But that's it for this one, and I absolutely love the way it turned out. But what do you guys think? For this one, I'm using Jenga blocks and gluing 7 of the long edges together. To make sure the blocks are all straight on the bottom, I use my L roller and attach them using Starbond super glue. And I made 6 sets of these 7 blocks. Once I had all 6 sets, I started laying them out to create a hexagon shape, which took some playing around. Now there is a little gap at each corner where the blocks meet, so I cut down a dowel, measuring it up against a Jenga block, and used that to reinforce the corners and hold everything together. I wanted to make this like a floral pocket and started adding more Jenga blocks around the front. I did this in a staggered pattern, starting on each side and meeting in the middle. But once I got to the middle, there was a gap where a whole block wasn't going to fit, and instead of cutting a block down, I started a second layer with the first block right in the center and then built out on either side. And when I got to the edges, there was a small bit of the blocks hanging off, but you really can't tell. For the back of the pocket, so you can add florals or greenery, I had this hexagon foam core board cut out already from a previous project that I didn't end up using, so I drew a line down inside of the pocket so you won't see it when it's hung up against the wall and have something for the greenery to sit up against. I cut the foam core board down and then painted it in the color Fawn to blend in a little bit more with the blocks and hot glued it to the back. This project was a fail, but I was at least able to save it and do something a little bit different than my original design. I'm taking this Dollar Tree planter, which is honestly super flimsy, but the bottom comes off for water drainage. And what I want to do with this one, I need the drainage holes with the bottom left on. So taking my spade bit, you could also use a regular drill bit or even a knife. I just need to add some holes. I also have this little saucer from Lowe's that I'm going to add 2 holes in as well. Next, taking E6000, I'm going to attach the smaller saucer to the bottom of the planter, and here's where I made my first mistake. I also should have glued the removable part from the original Dollar Tree planter in place, but I didn't think about that. The next day, when the glue was dry, I'm taking this lightweight spackle and going to spread it all over the planter. I was trying to speed up the dry process here, and that's where I made the second mistake. I'm really trying to keep up the quality of my videos while my 9-to-5 work life is pretty chaotic. I really only have 1.5 days to put projects together until my boss comes back from maternity leave. Anyways, I set this in front of my heat vent to help it dry, and this actually caused it to crack. And it cracked right along the seam where the removable base is. And I think even if I had glued that down, it still would have cracked because there were cracks in other areas. That heat was just forcing it to dry quicker than it naturally would have. But I kept going and I sanded the spackle down to be smoother. I originally wanted to etch a design into the spackle, but with the amount of texture on this, that wasn't going to look good. I am going to come back to this at a later date. Anyways, I added another thin layer of spackle where the crack was, which I didn't record for some reason, and allowed it to dry naturally, not in front of the heat. This time it did not crack apart, and I sanded it down again to make this section blend as seamlessly as I could get it. Next, I'm taking Fawn by Waverly. It's a slightly warm tone, medium brown, and I love this color so much. I painted a thick coat all over, making sure to get in all the deep cracks and crevices. Once the paint's dry, I'm taking this white wax, also by Waverly. I really want to try the DIY white wax because this one is just okay in my opinion. But using a chippy brush, I added a heavy dry brush on top of the fawn paint and then wiped it off. I did pour the wax into my paint tray so I don't get the brown paint in it and contaminate it. I love the dimension this added to the planter. This material absolutely needs to be sealed, especially if you plan to keep a live plant in it like I do. To seal it, I used this Rust-Oleum clear enamel in matte, so even though this didn't turn out how I wanted, I still love the way it looks in the end. For more DIY mega videos, check out this video right here, and I'll see you next week with some brand new projects.